The fading light of the desert sun cast long amber shadows across Ezra Whitmore's land as he trudged back toward his cabin after a long day of fencing work. He paused near the edge of his property, something catching his eye by the old stone well, just a dark smudge against the red dust. At first he thought it might be a wild animal, maybe a wounded coyote or a deer that had wandered too far from the canyon. But something about the stillness of the figure unsettled him. It wasn't just still, it was collapsed, surrendered to the earth in a way that didn't speak of sleep, but of suffering. Ezra narrowed his eyes against the dying light and stepped closer, instincts sharpened from years of living alone in this unforgiving land. He gripped the stock of his Winchester not in panic, but in habit, the way a man did when he wasn't sure what he was walking into. Ezra moved slowly, boots crunching over dry earth rifle, lowered but ready as he closed the distance. He knew better than to let curiosity outrun caution. Many things in the desert looked harmless until they moved, and sometimes not even then. The way the figure had folded into the ground, limbs at odd angles, reminded him of a deer after a hard fall, bones too weak to carry on. But as he drew near, the contours sharpened and his breath caught, not from fear but from recognition. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The figure was small, barely more than a child. Tangled black hair clung to the face matted with dust and streaks of dried blood. Ezra tightened his grip on the rifle heart, beating faster now, not from threat, but from something stranger like the past, reaching for him through this girl lying broken in the dust. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her clothing, once traditional Apache garb, was torn, and stained threads unraveling from days of wear and abuse. Blood had dried in crusted streaks along her forehead and arms, and her skin, bronze by nature, looked pale, almost gray with blood loss. Her lips were cracked and dry, barely parting with each shallow breath. Ezra knelt beside her, brushing the dirt gently from her cheek with the back of his hand, fingers calloused from years of ranch work. Her pulse, when he found it at the side of her neck, was thready and consistent like a candle flickering against the wind. He listened to the rhythm of her breaths, irregular, faint, and felt a sharp pull in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. This wasn't just a girl. This was someone's daughter. And whoever she belonged to, whatever had brought her here, she was dying right outside his fence. Ezra's thoughts spun. Taking in a wounded Apache girl wasn't just dangerous, it was practically suicidal in these parts. The territory had long been a powder keg, white settlers and native tribes coexisting under a thin, brittle crust of uneasy peace. One spark could set the whole region ablaze, and harboring someone like her could be seen as treason by both sides. If word got out that she was on his land, he might find himself gunned down by cavalrymen looking to maintain control or by Apache warriors seeking vengeance. But all of that, the fear, the politics, the survival instincts faded into the background when he looked into her face. There was no war in those features, only suffering, only humanity. Ezra had lived alone for years since his wife passed, had forgotten what it felt like to care deeply about another life. But now something ancient and instinctive stirred inside him, and without a word he slid his arms beneath her frail body and lifted her. She was alarmingly light, like a bundle of sticks held together by skin and prayer. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her toward the cabin, the dusk deepening into shadow behind them. Ezra's home was modest: one room, a fireplace, a wooden table, a worn chair, and a single bed that had not held another soul since his wife's passing 5 years prior. He pushed open the door with his boot and laid the girl gently on the bed, her body limp, breath barely audible. He moved quickly, lighting the oil lamp, fetching water from the well, and retrieving the small bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He cleaned her wounds with the steady hands of a man used to fixing broken things: horses, fences, lives. The gash on her forehead, the cuts along her arms, they were raw, angry, and wrong. As he dressed each wound, his jaw clenched tighter. This wasn't survival damage. This was cruelty. By the glow of the oil lamp, the truth became clear. The girl hadn't merely been hurt, she had been marked. The cuts on her arms weren't random scrapes from brush or falls. They followed patterns almost ceremonial in shape, lines too straight, symmetrical. Ezra had seen things during his youth, brutal men doing brutal things, but this felt different. It was methodical, almost like someone had wanted to make a point with pain. His stomach turned as he imagined the horror this girl had endured. The bruises, the swelling, the ripped fabric, everything pointed not just to violence but to possession. She had been someone's prisoner, not just a victim of the wild. He paused, staring at the soft rise and fall of her chest, trying to imagine how someone so young, so small, had survived such brutality long enough to reach his fence. As he rinsed another blood-stained cloth in the basin, she stirred, just a twitch, at first, a subtle flinch beneath the covers. Then her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark eyes cloudy with pain but alert. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he didn't understand, but the tone in her voice was unmistakable, a plea, raw and desperate. Ezra leaned closer, setting down the cloth, and speaking softly, not knowing if his words reached her at all. "You're safe now," he whispered. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." She blinked slowly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him, and then her eyes drifted shut again. He stayed by her side, murmuring words that she might not comprehend, but that carried warmth in their rhythm. She was in a stranger's cabin, wounded and alone, but Ezra made sure that the first sounds she heard in her fragile consciousness were kind ones. As the desert night deepened and stars pierced the black sky outside his small window, Ezra settled into his worn chair beside the bed rifle across his lap. The girl's breathing had evened out into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep, but he didn't dare close his own eyes. His ears strained at every shift of wind through the brush, every creak in the wooden walls. He had taken a risk that might cost him everything, and, though he didn't regret it, the weight of what might come was beginning to settle heavy on his shoulders. He had no idea who she was or what kind of storm might follow her to his doorstep, but something in his bones told him it was already on its way. Ezra stared out the window, watching the stillness of the desert, knowing full well that it wouldn't last. Something was coming with the dawn, and whatever it was, it would change his life forever. The first pale light of dawn had just begun to spill through the cabin's small window when Ezra heard a sound that didn't belong to morning, deep, rhythmic, and growing louder by the second. At first, he thought it was thunder rolling in from the mesa, but the cadence was too steady, too deliberate. His blood turned cold as he recognized it. Hooves. Not one or two, but many dozens pounding against the hard-packed desert floor. He stood quickly, careful not to jostle the sleeping girl, and moved to the window with the rifle in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the dread in his gut. Trouble had come. Not just in theory, not in vague fears whispered to himself through the night, but real living trouble riding toward his land at the break of day. What he saw beyond the glass stole the breath from his lungs. Silhouettes were rising from the desert mist riders, emerging from the orange haze of dawn like ghosts made flesh. He counted a dozen at first, then 24, then more, as shapes continued appearing over the ridges and from behind scrub. They weren't charging. They didn't need to. Instead, they moved like predators, spreading out with quiet intent, forming a perimeter that grew tighter with every heartbeat. They took positions behind rocks, in creek beds, atop nearby slopes, each one a silent statement, no escape. Ezra gripped his rifle tighter, watching as his small homestead became the center of a slow, patient encirclement. These men were not a scouting party. They were warriors, disciplined, methodical, and judging by their numbers, they were here for one reason, Ayana. Behind him, he heard a shift, the soft rustle of cloth on cotton. The girl was stirring. Her breath caught as she sat up slowly, pain twisting her features. Then her eyes fell on the window, and everything about her changed. The color drained from her face, and her body tensed like a cornered animal. "No," she whispered hoarsely, the word barely audible but filled with dread. Ezra turned, stepping closer, unsure of how much she understood. "You need to see this," he said, gently, helping her rise. She leaned on him for support, weak but determined. When she reached the window and saw the war party forming outside, her expression turned to something beyond fear, a silent scream, a soul remembering every horror that had brought her here. Her lips moved in Apache, and Ezra heard a single word that struck like a lightning bolt. "Father." Ezra looked at her in shock, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. "Father," he repeated. Ayana nodded weakly and placed a trembling hand on her chest. "Ayana," she said clearly, then pointed outside to the ridge where a new figure had appeared on horseback. Her voice trembled as she said it again. "Father." Ezra followed her gaze and saw him an older warrior, distinguished in posture and dress, sitting atop his horse like a statue carved from ironwood. Even at this distance, Ezra could sense the gravity that clung to the man. A chief, no doubt. And if Ayana was truly his daughter, then her presence in Ezra's cabin was far more than a misunderstanding. It was a provocation, one that had summoned an entire war party to his doorstep. The implications landed on Ezra like a falling stone. Ayana wasn't just an injured girl, she was the daughter of a tribal leader, maybe the tribal leader, which meant her people believed she had been taken harmed or worse by someone from outside. And now, as the sun rose higher over the desert, they had followed her trail to his door. Ezra's act of mercy had not gone unnoticed. It had triggered a reaction that could easily turn violent. He looked at the girl who now sat back down on the bed, her hands shaking as she held them to her lips. He didn't know what had happened to her before she reached his land, but it was clear she feared the very people outside, and yet they had come for her with overwhelming force. Ezra was trapped between the girl's terror and a father's army. The warriors outside moved with the calm of men who had no intention of rushing. Their silence was more terrifying than a shout would have been. Then, as if on cue, a low drum beat began, deep, resonant, like the pulse of the land itself. It came from somewhere unseen but filled the air with dread. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, measured, and unrelenting. Ezra felt it in his chest as much as he heard it. The rhythm spread like a heartbeat across the desert, echoing off stone and scrub, sending a clear message judgment had arrived. The beat didn't speed up, didn't rise in fury. It simply existed like an eternal countdown. Ezra glanced once more at Ayana, whose eyes were now fixed on the window, and saw her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps a curse. The figure on the ridge remained motionless while others took positions around him. His presence alone held the others in formation. Ezra could tell that this was no ordinary leader. His bearing was too still, his gaze too unwavering. The man radiated command. Ezra turned to Ayana, who nodded slowly, confirming the unspoken truth. Her lips formed the word again, "Father." And this time Ezra saw the full weight of emotion behind it, not just fear, but longing, sorrow, love, and something else, betrayal, perhaps. The man who had come for her was not simply a rescuer. He was a father whose daughter had vanished, and now he stood outside the cabin of a white rancher with a rifle, judging the fate of all within. Ezra knew then that every decision he made next would be watched, weighed, and remembered. Suddenly, a lone warrior rode forward from the perimeter, his movements slow but precise. He stopped just outside the range of Ezra's rifle and raised his voice not with anger, but with grim finality. "White man, you have something that belongs to us," he called out in accented English. The threat was implied, not screamed. Send her out, or face the consequences. Ezra could feel Ayana trembling beside him, clutching his arm, her face pale with dread. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing to the warriors, to herself, then to him, warning, pleading, trying to explain something urgent. But the circle outside was tightening, and the message was clear. Time was running out. Ezra was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The sun was rising fast, and with it came the full weight of an entire nation's judgment. Whatever came next would decide everything. Ezra stood in the center of his small cabin, the weight of 100 warriors pressing in from all sides, though they hadn't yet crossed his fence. The voice of the Apache rider still echoed in his ears. "Send out the girl, and maybe you live." His hands gripped the rifle harder, but he knew the truth. He could fight, but he couldn't win. Not against that many. Still, the girl beside him, Ayana, trembled at the thought of going back. Her dark eyes brimmed with silent terror, and it was clear that returning to her people meant facing something far worse than dying in this cabin. Ezra had a choice: surrender her to a fate she clearly feared, or stand between her and the storm, knowing it might cost him his life. In all his years, he'd never faced a decision so black and white or so gray. She moved away from the window, her legs unsteady but full of urgency. Her torn sleeve slid back, revealing the angry red marks Ezra had cleaned in the night. But now, in the full light of morning, he saw them clearly for what they were: not just wounds, but symbols. The cuts followed deliberate patterns, like glyphs carved in flesh, each one telling a story he couldn't read. She caught him staring and pulled the fabric down quickly, ashamed, afraid. Ezra didn't press, but something in him shifted. This wasn't just a girl who'd been lost. She had been taken, branded, hurt with intention. The kind of pain that spoke of ritual, of punishment, of control. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't over yet, and she was terrified that going back meant it would begin again. The warrior outside raised his voice again, sharper this time. 1 minute, white man. His horse stamped impatiently as he waited for compliance. Ayana flinched and grabbed Ezra's sleeve, pulling him toward her, speaking in rapid Apache, her voice desperate. She pointed outside, then to herself, then shook her head violently. Tears welled in her eyes. He couldn't understand her words, but the meaning in her gestures was unmistakable. She was begging him not to send her back. Ezra's jaw clenched. He looked down at her and whispered, "I don't know what they did to you, but I believe you." Her body sagged with momentary relief, but fear still trembled through every muscle. Outside, the warriors were growing impatient, and Ezra felt the fuse burning lower by the second. He didn't need translation to know they were preparing for blood. Before the tension could snap, a new rider galloped from the ridge, younger than the chief, but with a face cut from the same stone. He reined in his horse near the first warrior and began speaking rapidly in Apache. From inside, Ezra watched the heated exchange voices rising and cutting through the morning air. Ayana froze, then whispered a name: Cota. Her voice broke as she stepped toward the window. Again, fingers splayed against the glass. The young warrior looked toward the cabin, his voice now louder, this time in English. "Sister, are you alive?" Ayana cried out in return, voice hoarse but clear. Their words flew back and forth, the emotion in them so strong it made Ezra's throat tighten, even without understanding the language. Cota's expression softened, then turned grim. He looked at Ezra not with hatred but with wary calculation. From behind the window, Ezra could feel Ayana's urgency as she spoke to her brother. Her hands moved quickly as she explained, pointing to her bandages, the cabin, and finally to Ezra himself. Cota listened without interrupting, though his eyes darkened with each word. When she was done, he dismounted and stepped closer to the fence. "She says you helped her," he called out to Ezra, his tone no longer threatening, just cautious. "You gave her water. You cleaned her wounds." Ezra nodded slowly, stepping into view, but keeping the rifle at his side. "That's right," he answered. "I found her half dead outside my fence. I did what any decent man would do." Cota translated the words for the warriors behind him. Some nodded quietly. Others stared unmoved. The battle wasn't over, but a bridge had been built. Cota turned back toward the Apache assembly and addressed them in his native tongue, gestures, sweeping voice strong. Ayana continued to speak from the cabin, backing his account with her own. Then Cota faced Ezra again, his expression now sharpened by anger, not at Ezra, but at something else. "She was taken 3 days ago," he said, "by men who trade in people, white men, but not you. They tried to sell her to the east. She escaped, ran 2 days through the desert, and fell at your fence." Ezra's gut clenched. The story fit the wounds, the bruises, the desperation in her eyes. She hadn't been running from her people. She had been running toward life, any life. And now Ezra was the reason she had one. The line between rescuer and suspect was beginning to blur, and the truth was finally surfacing. Cota stepped closer, just past the edge of Ezra's fence, his hand resting lightly near the hilt of his knife, not as a threat, but from habit. Ezra didn't move, didn't flinch. He met the young warrior's gaze with steady eyes. "I didn't touch her," Ezra said plainly. "I didn't ask her for anything, I just couldn't let her die." Cota's jaw flexed, then nodded once. "She says you spoke kindly, that you gave her your own bed." Ezra shrugged. "I slept in the chair. It wasn't a boast, just fact." Cota looked back toward the ridge where the chief still sat, silent, unmoving. "My father will decide," he said, "but I will speak for you." The weight of those words hung in the air, one brother's willingness to defend a stranger. A sliver of trust had been carved into the space between them. Finally, the figure on the ridge dismounted, walking with deliberate calm toward the cabin, his steps slow, his authority absolute. Chief Nailish. His presence silenced the warriors like a wind snuffing out flame. As he drew close, Ayana stepped into view beside Ezra and began speaking in Apache, her voice rising and falling like a tide of emotion. She gestured to her bandages, to the chair where Ezra had slept, to the rifle he never pointed at her. The chief listened without interruption, his face unreadable, carved in the stillness of stone. When she finished, silence reigned. The warriors waited. Ezra waited. Even the desert seemed to still itself, caught in the balance between war and grace. And then the chief spoke his English, slow, heavy, but clear. She says, "You saved her life." And just like that, the judgment had begun. Chief Nailish stopped just 10 feet from the cabin door, his presence quiet but commanding, his hands empty and visible. Ezra watched him carefully, the rifle still resting in his arms, not aimed but not lowered either. Ayana stood beside him, trembling slightly, her gaze locked on her father's face. For a long moment the chief said nothing, simply studying the scene, his daughter injured and guarded by a white man in a land still raw with wounds from past wars. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured. "White man," he said, "I am Nal Nish, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. The girl is my daughter, blood of my blood. You will return her to me now." It wasn't a question nor a request. It was the command of a man used to being obeyed without hesitation. Before Ezra could respond, Ayana stepped forward, her voice rising in Apache, firm, passionate, and full of emotion. She gestured back to the cabin, to her wounds, to the rifle Ezra still held but had never pointed at her. Her words poured out like a flood, urgent and unrelenting. Though Ezra couldn't understand the language, he saw the story she was telling in every movement, how he had cleaned her wounds, given her shelter, spoken kindly, and asked for nothing in return. Her hands lifted to show the bandages he had wrapped, the marks of care, not captivity. The warriors watched in silence, their faces unreadable, but the power of her defense was undeniable. Ayana wasn't just speaking for Ezra, she was protecting him in the only way she knew how. Chief Nalish did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched his daughter, his face carved from restraint, but his eyes betraying a deeper emotion, something between sorrow and relief. Her voice cracked near the end of her speech, and for a moment silence filled the space between father and daughter. Then the chief turned his gaze to Ezra. "She says you cleaned her wounds," he said in English. "That you gave her your own bed while you slept in a chair. That you spoke gently to her even though she did not understand your tongue." Ezra gave a quiet nod, not seeking praise, only confirming the truth. The chief inhaled slowly, and the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. "This is not the way of most white men," he said, "but perhaps it is your way." After another long pause, the chief raised his voice to the assembled warriors. He spoke in Apache, short, direct commands. Some of the men stiffened, others exchanged glances, but none interrupted. Then Nalish turned back to Ezra. "I have told my warriors," he said, "that you are under my protection, that if any harm comes to you, it will be as if it came to me." Ezra felt the weight of those words sink into his bones. It was more than gratitude, it was a public declaration of honor, of debt. In a land where survival often trumped principle, this was sacred. But even as relief flickered through him, he noticed the subtle shift among the warriors. Some accepted the decree, others did not. One warrior pushed his horse forward, breaking the line with a sense of barely contained fury. He was younger than the chief, but held himself with unmistakable authority. His voice rang out in Apache, loud-clipped, accusatory. Ezra couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The anger was clear, and so was the target, him. Ayana turned toward the warrior, alarm etched into her face. "Cota," she whispered to Ezra, war leader under father. The two men, chief and war leader, began to argue. The others watched closely, shifting in their saddles, unsure of which side would prevail. Ezra stood still, rifle in hand, heart pounding. This was no longer just about him and the girl. It was about leadership pride and the fragile line between strength and weakness in the eyes of a tribe at war. Cota's words became sharper, more aggressive. Then, to Ezra's surprise, he switched to broken English. "White men always lie," he growled. "Today you help. Tomorrow you bring soldiers. Better to kill you now before you tell others where we camp." His logic was brutal and hard to refute. Ezra took a breath, stepped forward, and replied calmly, "I give you my word. I won't tell anyone. I'm not here to bring trouble." Cota spat into the dust. "White man's word. Worth nothing." Around them murmurs rippled through the warriors, the fragile peace balanced on a blade's edge. Cota was not just questioning Ezra's character, he was questioning the wisdom of the chief himself. The chief's decision to spare Ezra was being interpreted by some as weakness, and in warrior culture weakness was deadly. Ezra's voice remained steady, but he could feel the eyes of every warrior pressing down on him like desert heat. "I didn't help her to gain favor," he said. "I helped her because it was the right thing to do, because someone had to." He turned toward Cota, locking eyes with him. She was dying. What kind of man leaves a girl like that to rot in the dirt? Cota's lips curled in contempt, but he said nothing. Ayana stepped forward again, placing herself between the two men. She spoke quickly, passionately, gesturing to Ezra's hands, then to the picture frame on his table, the one of his late wife. She was drawing connections, building bridges, trying to make Cota see what she had seen. What Ayana said next brought a silence that fell heavier than any argument. She moved toward Cota's horse, speaking in Apache with desperate urgency. Her words were rapid, sincere, and full of fire. Whatever she said, it shook the war leader. He looked down at her, then up at Ezra. "She says," he murmured slowly, "you have scars, not soft hands of a man who takes, but hands of one who builds." He dismounted, stepping closer to Ezra's eyes, scanning him not as a threat, but as a puzzle. She also says he added you have picture of dead woman on your table. She thinks you understand loss. Like we understand loss. The words pierced deeper than Ezra expected. Cota looked at the rifle in Ezra's hands, then at the girl by his side. And for the first time the hatred in his eyes dimmed, not gone, but tempered by something that looked almost like respect. The tension between the chief and his war leader had cooled, but not vanished. Cota, still standing close to Ezra, turned to Chief Nailish and spoke in Apache with a tone that held less fury, but more weight. After a moment of quiet exchange, the chief looked at Ezra, his expression solemn. Cota has made a proposal, he said. Not all believe your honor is enough. Not yet. He asks for proof, not with words, but with action. Ezra felt his shoulders tighten. He had already risked his life just by helping Ayana. Now they were asking more. What kind of action, he asked. Nailish paused, then replied, "Help us stop the men who took my daughter. Ride with us. Fight with us." It wasn't a demand. It was a challenge, one that would define everything that came next. Ezra's mind raced. Slavers. The word alone turned his stomach. He'd heard whispers of such men, monsters who sold women and children into lives of torment, but he'd never come face to face with the results, until Ayana fell into his life broken and bleeding. Now they were asking him not just to care, but to act, to leave his ranch, his safety, and take up arms beside people who hours ago had been ready to kill him. He looked at Ayana, then at the chief, and finally at Cota. "You want me to hunt them down," he said quietly. "You want me to fight with you." Cota didn't blink. "If you are the man she says you are, then yes. Fight with us. Show the others she is right to trust you." Chief Nailish stepped forward again, his voice low but firm. "Mercy without strength is a weakness. Strength without mercy is cruelty. You showed mercy. Now show strength." Ezra stood in silence, the words sinking in like roots into dry soil. He wasn't just being asked to prove himself to the Apache. He was being asked to prove that compassion could stand beside conviction, that the kind of man who saves a wounded girl could also protect others from the evil that wounded her in the first place. It was a line drawn in the dust, and crossing it would change everything. This wasn't about honor anymore. It was about who he chose to be when it truly mattered. His fingers drifted to the calloused palm of his free hand, then to the pocket where he kept a worn photograph. His wife, her smile forever frozen, in a moment long gone. He could almost hear her voice again, soft and steady. A man's character isn't measured when people are watching. It's measured when no one sees, and you act anyway. Ezra felt her words settle inside him like a compass, finding true north. The quiet life he'd built since losing her had been peaceful, yes, but it had also been small, safe, empty. Saving Ayana had cracked something open, and now, standing at the edge of a choice that could cost him everything, he realized he wasn't afraid. Not really. He just needed to decide who he still was. He looked at Cota, then the chief, then back at Ayana. "When do we leave?" he asked, his voice firm. Chief Nailish didn't smile, but something softened in his features. "Now," he said, "the slavers expect a delivery tomorrow. We ride before sunset." Cota gave a single nod of approval, nothing more, but the gesture carried weight. Around them, warriors began preparing as if the decision had already been made. Ezra watched as men adjusted saddles, checked weapons, and reformed their ranks not as enemies now, but as allies. He hadn't fired a shot yet, but his choice had spoken louder than any bullet. And in that moment, Ezra crossed an invisible threshold from lone rancher to something more. Cota stepped forward, holding out his hand, not in threat but in recognition. "If you ride with us," he said, "you ride as brother. Apache brother. That means we protect you. You protect us, even to death." Ezra reached out and clasped the warrior's forearm, feeling the heat and weight of a shared promise pass between them. Around them, the Apache warriors nodded, some hesitant, others more sure, but the gesture marked a shift. Ezra was no longer a tolerated outsider. He had been welcomed into something sacred. He had not just earned trust, he had earned place. Not all agreed, not yet, but the bond had been made, and in Apache tradition, bonds sealed in blood, and battle could not be undone. As Ezra prepared to mount the horse they had brought him, Ayana approached quietly. She looked stronger now, still healing, still tired but upright and steady. She held something in her hand, a simple bracelet made of leather and bone. "For you," she said softly, her English halting. "For life, for honor, for being good man." She reached up and tied it around his wrist herself, fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Ezra said nothing but nodded deeply, overcome by the weight of that small gesture. It wasn't just thanks, it was acknowledgement, a mark of shared experience, of gratitude that could not be fully spoken. That simple piece of leather meant more than medals or applause. It meant belonging. As the war party assembled and final preparations were made, Ezra stood on the threshold of his cabin one last time. He looked back at the empty chair, the table, the picture of his wife. This quiet life had sheltered him through grief, given him a place to heal. But now it felt like a chrysalis, something meant to be left behind. Ayana's bracelet tugged gently at his wrist as he mounted his horse, and he knew with certainty that the man who had first found her in the dust was already gone. What remained was someone new, not just a rancher, not just a rescuer, but a man who had chosen to fight not for revenge, not for glory, but because the world needed fewer cowards and more hands, willing to lift others from the dirt. And so he rode toward Snake Creek, and whatever waited there. The sun dipped low on the horizon as Ezra rode with the Apache war party, the red sky streaked with fading fire. The terrain was harsh, rocky gullies, sharp inclines, cactus thickets, but the warriors moved through it with the ease of mountain lions. Ezra kept pace, surprised by how naturally he followed their lead, how instinctively his hands adjusted to the horse's rhythm. No one spoke. The only sounds were hoofbeats and the occasional whisper of wind through mesquite. There was no need for conversation. Every man here knew the purpose of this ride. Ezra looked ahead at Cota and Chief Nalish riding at the front, and then behind at Ayana, who now bore the quiet strength of someone reclaiming herself. He had crossed into their world, and now there was no turning back. As night settled over the desert, the war party halted on a high ridge overlooking a dusty clearing beside Snake Creek. From their vantage point, Ezra saw it, several wagons positioned in a loose ring around a dying fire with shadows moving between them. Through a spyglass passed silently from warrior to warrior, he spotted iron bars welded crudely to wagon frames' cages. Inside them, motionless figures huddled, women and children slumped in unnatural stillness, bruised and defeated. 15 guards, Cota whispered beside him. Heavily armed, but careless. Ezra watched one man laugh while cleaning a rifle, another pass a jug between two others. These weren't disciplined soldiers. They were wolves fattened on fear, believing themselves untouchable. The sight hardened something in Ezra that had only begun forming. These weren't men. They were chains made flesh, and they needed to be broken. Chief Nalish outlined the plan with the calm efficiency of a commander who had led many into battle. "Half ride north," he said. "Make noise. Draw them to you. The rest slip in from behind. Free the cages." Ezra nodded as Cota continued in hushed tones. "They think they are safe. We let them think it. Then we hit." The warriors began dividing into 2 silent units. No arguments, no hesitation. Every man knew his role. Ezra chose the rescue group without question. His eyes had lingered too long on the cages to be anywhere else. Those people needed someone to unlock the door, to fight not with fury, but with purpose. He checked his rifle, then nodded to the others. The time for waiting was over. When the question came, "Which side do you ride with?" Ezra didn't hesitate. "With the cages," he said. It wasn't a heroic declaration. It was simple, solid, final. Cota gave a nod of quiet approval. "Good," he said. "They will need speed." And calm. As Ezra crouched with the rescue team studying the approach path under the cloak of dusk, he felt no fear. Only focus. This wasn't about proving himself anymore. This was about showing up where he was most needed. He thought of Ayana, of the scars carved into her arms, of the others who might wear the same wounds. It was no longer enough to save one girl. He needed to save the ones who hadn't yet made it to someone's doorstep. The first cries came from the north, loud, fierce Apache war shouts that pierced the silence like lightning. Gunshots followed, and as expected, the guards scrambled toward the noise, thinking it was the main assault. That was the moment. The rescue group moved in from the rear, swift and silent. Ezra reached the first cage where 3 girls no older than Ayana sat huddled. "We're here to help," he whispered, kneeling. "You're getting out." The lock resisted, but the butt of his rifle shattered it with one strike. The girls stared at him in disbelief, unsure whether to flee or flinch. "Go," he said again, waving them toward the rocks. All around him, other warriors were doing the same, freeing the forgotten, lifting the broken, turning chaos into liberation. As the last cage opened, shouts rose behind them, guards doubling back, realizing the deception. Ezra spun rifle raised just as 3 slavers charged through the smoke. His first shot dropped the leader. The others kept coming. He aimed again, but before he could fire, Cota appeared beside him, his rifle barking twice. The threat fell silent, but more were coming. Ezra fired again and again, the crack of gunfire ringing louder than his heartbeat. One guard lunged at a limping captive. Ezra tackled him without thinking, dragging the man down and slamming his elbow into the side of his skull. There was no hesitation now, no second-guessing, only the drive to protect, to make sure not one more innocent vanished into those cages. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but every second felt like a lifetime. By the end, the clearing was silent again, except for the crying of the freed, the soft murmurs of warriors checking on one another, the crackle of a fire no longer guarded by criminals. 15 slavers lay dead. None escaped. Ezra stood in the center of the camp chest, heaving blood on his shirt, not his own. Around him, women and children blinked into the firelight, like creatures waking from a long nightmare. 23 in total, some barely conscious, others weeping with joy or disbelief. Ayana walked among them, touching hands, offering words of comfort in a tongue Ezra could not speak. And he watched, knowing in his bones that this moment would stay with him longer than anything else in his life. As the captives were given water and bandages, Cota approached Ezra, his face still fierce but now open. "You fight well," he said simply. "Like Apache." Ezra didn't answer. He just nodded, too tired to speak, too full of everything that had just happened. Chief Nalish came next, clasping his forearm. "Because of you, families will see each other again," he said. "You changed what could not be changed with words." The warriors who had doubted him now offered nods, quiet murmurs of acknowledgement. There were no ceremonies, no speeches. But in Apache's silence, Ezra had been welcomed fully, not because he had spoken bravely, but because when the moment came, he had stood, he had bled. He had chosen the hard path not out of duty, but because his soul demanded nothing less. 3 days later, Ezra rode home, beneath a sky the color of cooling embers, the wind soft against his face. His land was just as he left it, quiet, undisturbed, the fence unbroken, the well still standing in the dust. But everything felt different. The silence no longer wrapped around him like a shield. It was open, welcoming, and somehow sacred. As he stepped onto his porch, the wood creaked beneath his boots in the same familiar way, but now it echoed with something new, the weight of all he had seen, all he had done. This place had once been a refuge from pain. Now it was a monument to the man he had chosen to become. On the small table by the window sat the photograph of his late wife, just as it had always been. But beside it now lay something new, a simple bracelet made of carved bone and leather left behind by Ayana when they parted. Ezra picked it up and turned it slowly in his fingers, the texture rough but unmistakably deliberate. It was more than a token. It was a symbol, a reminder of the night he had found a broken girl in the dirt and chose to carry her instead of walking away. He slipped it over his wrist, feeling the tightness settle against his skin like a second vow. Quiet, unshakable, true. He had watched as each of the 23 freed captives was guided into the care of someone who would help them find their way back, families, villages, settlements that had feared them dead. The tears, the embraces, the stunned laughter of reunion, they had struck Ezra harder than bullets ever could. There was no reward, no grand speech, only the quiet joy of restoration. Some of the captives had spoken a few words to him before they left. Others simply nodded through their tears. But all of them carried something away that night, the knowledge that someone had stood for them when they were invisible, and that evil hadn't won. When the Apache war party rode on, Ezra stood at the edge of the clearing and watched until they disappeared over the ridgeline. Chief Nalish had clasped his forearm one last time. "You have done what many would not," he said, "and because of that, the world is less dark." Cota, once his fiercest doubter, had said nothing, only nodded and touched Ezra's shoulder with a warrior's respect. Their paths were different now, but their bond was sealed. The Apache would continue their battle, protecting their own, fighting those who trafficked in flesh and fear. Ezra knew their road would be long and bloody, but he also knew they would not walk it alone. Back at the ranch, Ezra sat on the porch in the same chair he had occupied so many nights before, watching the sun melt behind the distant hills, casting long gold shadows across the dirt. But this time he didn't feel hollow. He didn't feel numb. He felt whole. He thought of Ayana's voice when she had whispered thank you in broken English. He thought of the fire in her brother's eyes, the quiet strength in the chief's final words. He realized something simple, something vital. It hadn't been the gun in his hands that changed things. It had been the choice to open them, to reach rather than retreat. The man who had once built fences to keep the world out had now torn down one inside himself. He had faced death not out of anger or revenge, but out of a sense of justice deeper than law. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, but sometimes symbols are made by action, not intention. He had ridden beside those who once viewed him as a threat, and now they called him brother. Ezra smiled faintly as the bracelet caught the sunset's light, a flash of pale bone against weathered skin. He was still alone on the land, but no longer alone in purpose. He knew this wasn't the last evil the world would show him. Somewhere more wagons were rolling, more cages were being built. But he also knew that next time if a shadow appeared in the dust or a scream rose from the canyon, he would not hesitate. Not because he was fearless, but because he now understood that fear means nothing compared to doing what is right. And when that test came again, he would not shrink from it. He would rise just as he had once before, rifle in hand, heart open, ready to walk into fire if that's what the moment demanded. Somewhere in the wind, the memory of that ride still echoed. Somewhere in the firelight, Ayana's voice still whispered her trust, still glowing like an ember that refused to die. Ezra Whitmore would not be remembered by many, but for those whose lives he touched, for the girl in the dust, for the children in the cages, for the warriors who once doubted him, his name would live on. If this story moved you, then stay a while longer, because what comes next will shake you even more. Click the next video. Let the fire stay lit. Let the story continue.